Okay, so what is gauge swatching in knitting and why is it important? You and I can use the same needles, the same yarn, and the same stitches in rows and still have wildly different sized swatches. And this mostly comes down to tension. Especially if you're a beginner knitter, tension might be quite an issue. You might be very loose or you might be very tight. And this can mean that the garment that you make is either wildly oversized or incredibly small and might be better for a child. Knitting gauge is essentially a way to standardize tension so that one pattern designer can ensure that everyone, no matter if they're a loose knitter or a tight knitter, can knit the same garment and come out with exactly the same piece. That's the theory anyway. If you're not knitting to gauge, then you are knitting blindly and just simply hoping for the best. Okay, so if you're knitting the Roomy Raglan, let's take a look at the pattern and see what the gauge swatch says. So the gauge is going to be 14 stitches by 22 rows in stockinette stitch on 6.5mm needles. What that means is you're going to use your 6.5mm needles, you're going to cast on 14 stitches, and then you're going to simply knit 22 rows. You're going to knit stitch on the right side, and then you're going to purl stitch on the wrong side. So 14 stitches by 22 rows should measure 4 inches by 4 inches or 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters. Usually it says this on the pattern, but that is a very standard swatch size. A swatch is also the perfect way to practice your knitting, especially if you're a little worried about knitting your first sweater. It's a great way to practice your tension, also to hit gauge of course, but also just to make sure you're feeling comfortable with things like casting on, knit stitches, purl stitches, and then it'll give you a little bind off practice too. If you don't know how to bind off, check the next video that I've just uploaded and you can see how to bind off there. When I'm knitting a swatch, I do tend to add on a couple of extra stitches, just around 2, because this helps me to really spread out the swatch. Sometimes the edge stitches can become a little bit annoying and it just makes it a little bit easier if the edge stitch is simply not to be measured, but it kind of is there to help spread out the swatch. Once you have finished a garment, you are going to do something called blocking, which essentially means you're going to submerge it in water and then you're going to stretch it out and lay it down and pin it. That helps to relax all the fibers and that is what your item is truly going to look like. So that's why people like to block their swatches. And if you don't block your swatch, then you're less likely to actually hit gauge. If you're making something like a scarf, then it probably isn't as necessary to wet block your swatch. But if you're making a sweater like we are in this knit along, I think it's very, very important, especially if you think your gauge is coming out a little small. Once you wet block it, you'll see that actually those fibers can stretch quite far depending on what you're using, and then you might actually hit gauge. Okay, check out the next video because this one got a little bit too long about what happens if you don't hit gauge and how to troubleshoot that.